Okay, guys. Hope everyone's doing well out there. It's about 5 afternoon, so I want to try to keep us on schedule. I'll get us started here in just a second. Just want to say thanks for joining us today. See some familiar faces on the list here. I think we've worked with some of you guys before, so good to see you. For those that haven't, I'll give myself a longer introduction here in a moment. My name is Will Simons. Pleasure to be with you virtually. Some of you may have sat in on this class before. I've been teaching this class, Fundamentals of Reserves, now for probably 7 or 8 years. So we've updated it recently, added some new content there, so hopefully you'll enjoy that. Just to let you know, I'm going to keep my camera on for now, but I'll turn it off during the class itself so that you can focus on the slides. So we'll start that in a moment. I want to say thanks to Jadi and everybody at AKAM for putting this on. I certainly appreciate the opportunity. We've worked with a number of your properties now and hope to continue adding to that list in the future. So thank you again. The class should run about 50 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So as the class goes on, feel free to submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom taskbar there. It's a relatively small group today, so we should be able to get through pretty much all the questions that you would have at the end. We are going to be recording the class as well, so we'll send out a follow-up email after today with the recording along with the slides of the class. So if anybody has a colleague or a board, somebody that wasn't able to attend, that you think they might get some benefit out of this class, feel free to share that with them. We don't have any problem with that at all, so feel free to pass along the slides. And the recording is going to be on YouTube, so that'll be a public recording. You can pass along that link to anybody that you like. Okay, let's see, another bit of housekeeping. We'll be submitting all of the course credits to the DBPR probably within the next day or two to get everybody credit, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email with your course certificates as well, and we'll try to get those out as quickly as we can. Just to give you guys a heads up, we've been having a lot of trouble getting responses from the DBPR lately. They seem to be very slow in terms of posting those credits, so if you log on in a couple of days or a week and you don't see them there, don't panic. We will be getting them to them as soon as we can, but I'm not sure how long their turnaround time is to actually post them to your account. So just bear with us, and appreciate your patience on that. Okay, we'll get this started now, and we'll get this going. So I'm going to switch off my camera. Yeah, you guys should all be able to see the slides here, but here we go. So stand by. Okay, all right, well, hello, thank you for joining us today, everybody. This class is called Fundamentals of Reserves. The class is approved for 1 hour of continuing education credit in either the insurance and financial management section or as an elective. I know a lot of you managers have, I think it's a September 30th renewal date, so hopefully this will help get you that renewal credit there. I believe we did this with the registration, but if you're concerned that we don't have your first name, last name, and CAM license number, please be sure to get that to me as soon as you can. Otherwise, I won't be able to get you credit for today's class. Now, with that said, I always try to point out that this class is not just for managers. Board members, committee members, residents of your communities, really anybody who sits in on this should learn a great deal about reserve budgeting and planning, and hopefully come away better prepared to lead and serve their communities. So if you feel that this might be useful to any of the properties that you work with, feel free to spread that around. Mentioned earlier, we're going to give out copies of the slides for today's presentation. So feel free to take notes as we're going along, but don't feel like if you miss something that it's going to be gone forever. We'll have the recording you can watch, we'll have the slides, so if you're confused by any of the numbers or you want to go back and view something again, you'll definitely have that opportunity. Okay. All right, before I get started, I'll just take another moment to introduce myself and our company in a little bit more detail. As I said, my name is Will Simons. I'm the president of the Florida office for Association Reserves. I've been with our company since 2008. Spent most of my career in Florida, where we've had clients going back to the early 1990s. The RS after my name stands for Reserve Specialist. That's an industry-specific credential that's only awarded to people who have demonstrated their expertise and experience in preparing reserve studies. The designation comes from CAI, Community Associations Institute. I'm sure you're all very familiar with them. There's only been a couple hundred people to have ever earned the RS credential over the last 20 plus years or so. Personally, I've lived in both condos and HOAs. I spent about 6 years serving as the treasurer of my own community in South Florida, where I oversaw a budget of over $1 million there. The reason I point that out is because I know what it's like to be on the other side of the table, right? I've worked with volunteers, with board members, with committees who are responsible for taking on the management of their communities, which can represent, at least in my case, hundreds of people. And for pretty much any property in South Florida, a community association is made up of many millions of dollars, could be tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property value. So, we always try to keep that in mind when we're working with our clients. So who is Association Reserves? Basically, our company is the oldest and largest reserve study provider in the United States. We've been in this business since 1986, and we've completed tens of thousands of reserve studies for really all different types of properties all around the world. We've got offices from coast to coast, and we have more credentialed reserve specialists on staff than any other company. The majority of the work that we do is for community associations, which, as we'll talk about, includes all types of condos, HOAs, timeshares, and other types of residential communities. But we also have a great deal of experience with other property types. So things like office buildings, hotels, resorts, worship facilities, churches, schools, and so forth. One thing I always do like to point out is that this is our only job as a company. We only prepare reserve studies. So we're not an engineering firm, not an accounting firm, but specifically a very specialized consulting firm that's focused on doing this one thing really well, which is to guide our clients towards a successful financial future. The way that we do that is by preparing accurate and reliable reserve studies that will help those clients to forecast and budget for major projects. So we feel like if we do our job well and our clients follow the plans that we help them to design, hopefully the end result is that they're able to reduce the risk of special assessments and bank loans and other types of financial distress. So if you want any additional information, our website's going to be down here in the bottom right corner. It's just reservestudy.com. My email address will be up on the screen at the end as well, but if you have any questions, you can email those to me at wsimons, so that's WSIMONS at reservestudy.com. Okay. This is what we're going to cover today. The course really just has two sections. We'll spend a little bit of time in the beginning with this sort of basic question, what are reserves? And then we'll spend the majority of the class talking about reserve studies and how those are used by community associations to make sure they're on the right track, especially with regard to long-term planning and forecasting. Along the way, I've got some slides in here where we'll look at communities that we're not adequately funding. Those are going to be some real-world examples of what can happen when reserves are ignored. So again, feel free to take notes as you go along, submit those questions as we go, and we'll be able to get through those at the end. All right. Okay, one last thing before we move on. I try to include this slide in every presentation that I give because I think it includes a very common reaction or mindset when it comes to long-term planning. Okay, so what we see out there, and I'm sure what you guys see amongst your communities that you work with, is this common reluctance to embrace the responsibility of long-term planning. Okay, and I think this guy here represents a typical attitude that we see when it comes to thinking about budgeting for reserves. If you look at this guy, he's got his eyes closed, his fingers crossed, this kind of pained look on his face. So if there's one message that I want you all to remember from the class today, it's that it's our job to go out there to the communities that we work with and help them get over this mindset. And let's get around that, okay? It's our responsibility as professionals in this field to educate the people that we work with, talk to those people around us and really convince them not to let excuses get in the way, right? Our job is to help the people that we're working with to take action to help themselves, all right? So we'll again start with this basic question. Okay, what are reserves? For those of you who have been in the field for a while, this is probably going to be somewhat elementary, but if you're newer to management or it's just been a while since you've worked on drafting a budget, we'll just spend a couple of minutes here talking about the two main aspects of any community association's budget. Okay. So basically, the budget's categorized in my mind into two main sections. You've got your operating funds and your reserve funds. We'll talk first about the operating fund. So this money is essentially there for your routine costs of what I always call running the business of the community association, right? These are going to be the daily, weekly, monthly expenses for things like utilities and insurance, payroll, preventive maintenance, contracts, all that routine day-to-day type stuff. So if you want to think of this in personal terms, you might think of your operating account somewhat like your own personal checking account, right? What I mean by that is that your operating funds are unrestricted. Okay, that means you can spend operating money on any bill that the association has to pay. Now, that money is typically going to be spent in the same year that you collect it. So what that means is that if the budget was, really close, really tight budget, hopefully you won't have any significant surplus or deficit at the end of the year, right? You spend all of the money that you collect within a fiscal year during that same year, okay? Now, on the other hand, you've got your reserve account. So your reserve account or accounts, those are there for the long-term expenses that the association has to pay for. Some of those things may not occur for 5 or 10 or 25 years at a time, but when they do occur, those could be some of the biggest bills that the association will ever have to pay, right? So again, the reserve funds are going to be used for things like roof replacements, painting a building, pavement resurfacing. Those are kind of the classic 3 things that we look at in the condo world. But there's quite a lot of other projects that we'll talk about later on as well. Okay, some of the other difference between operating and reserve money is that, of course, reserve funds are restricted. What that means is that once you put $1 into a reserve account, that can only be spent on specific things, okay, not on any random project or cost that the association has to pay for. Another difference is that, again, in contrast to operating, reserve money will accumulate. So sometimes that takes place over many years. But what's happening is that the account balance will get built up until it needs to be spent for whatever that intended purpose was. Okay, so if you go back to the analogy we used earlier, in that way, your reserve account is more like a savings account for an individual. Okay, here on this slide, I've got a short excerpt from the Florida statutes. Specifically, we're looking at a section of Statute 718, which you all know is the condo statute. What I've highlighted in red here is the portion that talks about what associations must be reserving for. Okay, so if you look at that section in red there, the statute requires that condos reserve for 3 things in particular, and then they add in this one general definition at the end. Okay, so the 3 things they name specifically are going to be roofs, painting, and pavement. But then the general sort of catch-all definition that they have there at the end is for any other item with a replacement cost greater than $10,000. Okay, some of you might be wondering, why did they pick $10,000? And again, I've mentioned this class, I've been teaching this class for 7 or 8 years. I've asked this question to many, many different audiences, and nobody has ever given a clear answer as to why the number is $10,000. Okay, in other words, why wasn't it $1,000 or $25,000? The point is, nobody knows. My guess is that way back when they wrote the statute, they just picked a number that sounded pretty high and said, okay, let's go with that, right? So the point there is that the $10,000 number is totally arbitrary. And for many associations, that number is probably much too high of a threshold to set. So as we'll talk about later in the class, that maybe the more appropriate way to look at that dollar amount figure should be in terms of a question. What is a financially significant number to this association or to my association? Okay. On this slide here, this is a portion of the statute pertaining to HOAs. So the HOA statute 720 actually has even less to say about what you should be reserving for in a community association. This may not be as relevant to you guys. I think AKAM primarily focuses on condos, but in the event you do have any HOAs out there, basically all the HOA statute says, or really what it doesn't say, it doesn't give any sort of checklist of items that would need to be included, right? There's no corresponding sort of list of things that you would need to include in an HOA the same way we have it for condos. So pretty much all it says in reality is that, hey, there are certain things that the association is responsible for, and if you don't have any reserves, then that could result in a special assessment. Okay. Now the good news here is that there's a much more realistic and thorough way to go about defining what any association should be including in its reserve plan. We'll talk about that in just a little bit, but for now, I just want to have you keep this sort of basic definition in mind. Okay, reserve money is there for an association to save over a long period of time for major repair and replacement projects. Now, it's important to notice what I did not say. Right? I did not say that you could spend reserve money on capital improvements, on paying a insurance deductible, or really for any other purpose, right? Sometimes I make the joke, you can't go out and throw the world's greatest New Year's Eve party and drain your reserve fund, okay? As an example of one of those capital improvement questions, let's say that an association does not have a playground, but all of the residents really, really want to put some, playground in the community. Now, that might be a very wise thing and worthwhile thing to do, but they couldn't use any reserve money for that. Okay, that would be like adding a new element to the association, something that would have never been considered in any prior year budgets. So any prior reserve contributions would not have taken that cost into account. Okay, so in reality, that might be a great thing to do, but unfortunately, the initial expense, right, the construction of that playground would have to come out of some other fund, some other means. Now, once it was done, going forward, once the playground was built and in place, then the association would need to start reserving for it and be thinking of its long-term replacement cycles for, the equipment, the fence, the fall surface, the shade structure, all that kind of stuff. But just to make it clear, the initial cost of putting that playground in the first place, that is not something you could use reserve money for. All right. Let's see, I've gotten a couple of messages here asking if I'm muted. Yeah, so as of right now, you guys are all muted. If you have questions, the best place to submit those is in the Q&A feature, and we'll get to those all at the end. But I just want to try to keep us on schedule here. So, okay, that's basically the end of that first section. I told you it would be pretty short and sweet. A couple of times during the class, I'm going to break things up a little bit and take you through what I fondly call this sort of hall of shame. Okay, so every single one of these pictures you're going to see, this is an example of what goes wrong when associations are not properly funding their reserves. Okay, now I've taken a lot of these photos myself. Some of them were provided by our other staff members, but the reality is every one of these is a real life client that we've worked with. Now, the reason I'm including these is not to try to make fun of these communities. I'm not trying to kick them when they're down, but I want to use these as a sort of a cautionary tale just to show you what happens when communities are not taking financial responsibility, right? And they're not thinking about the long-term consequences of their budgets. All right. So one of the points that I like to make here, and which you'll see recurring in some of these photos, is that reserve funding is not only about fixing what's broken. Okay, it's maybe a more important concept to keep in mind that property value can be greatly affected just by the aesthetics of the common areas in the community. So in other words, it's not enough to just ask whether something is functional or not. Instead, the question should be, are we doing all that we can to try and make this an attractive place to live? Okay, not only for current owners, but for potential buyers as well, right? Okay, so looking at the photo here, obviously pretty nasty looking roof. I remember walking up on this roof, having to watch my step because if I took a wrong step, I was going to get flooded with a couple of inches of standing water in my shoes. Obviously not a good situation for a flat roof. If you just think about the weight of all that water for a moment, you can imagine that the weight of all that water just pressing down on the roof surface, it's a matter of time before it's going to find its way into this building, okay? Just to give you a sense of the weight, I mean, you all know what it's like to hold a gallon of water in your hand. But I believe it's either a cubic yard or a cubic meter of water weighs about 1 ton. Okay, so if you think of roughly a cube about 3 feet on each side, that weighs 1 ton. So imagine just the amount of rainfall we get in a typical summer rainstorm or hurricane in Miami. That's a ton of weight that's going to be hitting that roof, and it really, you don't have to think too hard to imagine how that would find its way into the building. Okay, this next one here, this is bad for a couple of reasons. What you're looking at now, this is called a mansard roof, which is essentially an architectural style where the roof shingles around the outer perimeter of the building, very, very steep, as you can see. I remember taking this photo and looking up at the building, wondering if I wanted to get any closer to it. Right, this is a 3-story building, and it's pretty easy to imagine one of those wood shingles just popping loose right at the wrong time when somebody's walking underneath it. Okay, now that could be anybody. It could have been me. It could be the mailman. It could be a landscaper. It could be somebody's grandson. Okay, so the point being, not only are the shingles not protecting the building anymore, okay, first of all, second of all, they look terrible, and third, that could be a pretty nasty accident and maybe a lawsuit waiting to happen if that falls and hits somebody. Okay, what you've got here in this photo, this is a seawall that's clearly failed. Originally, this was a metal sheet pile steel seawall. Basically, after a couple of decades of rust and corrosion, you see it essentially collapsing and basically turning back into dust. So I think really at this point, the client didn't have many options. I believe they were just going to kind of abandon this portion of the property and kind of let it go back to nature. Okay, on this one here, I would normally give the client some credit for attempting to do the right thing, but I think this is an example of too little, too late. Okay, now if you look closely at this photo, and I'll try to highlight this here, what you're looking at is this advanced pattern of deterioration and cracking. We call this alligatoring. Okay, it looks like an alligator's back, pretty simple. By any definition, this is a failed pavement surface. But the problem here is that the additional mistake that this client made was to try and just add new asphalt on top of old, right? So you can see this other new layer that they put right on top of it. And unfortunately, that was just kind of throwing good money after bad, because whatever they spent on this new surface, the top surface, was a total waste, right? You know, if they didn't bother to mill and remove the existing asphalt first, all of those cracks, that entire pattern is going to show back up through the surface again very quickly, probably within, you know, a year or two. And you can really see the cracks forming there. You know, it's already disintegrated here in the middle part, but you see the crack patterns, which probably are a mirror image of what's underneath there. Okay, last one in this section for now. I always kind of laugh at this because I'm not sure how it could ever get this bad. You know, point is, if you're taking a walk in this neighborhood, what are your options when you come up to this point, right? You have one option, which is you stumble off to the left here into these bushes. Option B, you have to push out into traffic to get around this. Now, not only that, obviously this is a pretty extreme scenario, but keep in mind the ADA definition of a trip hazard is only a 1/4 inch rise. Okay, so if you have communities with common sidewalks or walkways, you want to be doing annual inspections to make sure that anything above a 1/4 inch is getting ground down or cut out and fixed, because that could end up in a liability situation. So obviously, pretty extreme scenario here. For most people, again, that's you know, you could work around that, but think about somebody in a wheelchair or pushing a walker, you know, somebody pushing a stroller with a little kid. You know, this is not a good situation to have in your common areas. Okay, we'll switch gears now. We're going to talk about reserve studies and how those are used by community associations when they prepare their annual budgets. Okay, I'm sure you guys are all gearing up now, either started on your budget, or, you know, some of you, if you got an early start, maybe you're getting close to finishing that, but certainly an important message this time of year. Okay. So first, I just want to establish the definition of the term reserve study. That comes from National Reserve Study Standards. These standards have been in place for over 20 years now. Basically, a reserve study is a tool. Okay, it's a document, but it's a tool that does a couple of things for you. First, it will identify the current status of the reserve fund for that community. And then secondly, it provides a funding plan that will give guidance about how to deal with those future expenditures. Okay. Now, take a moment, notice what I didn't say. Again, a reserve study is not an insurance appraisal. It's not a turnover study, not an engineering report, but it's rather a very particular document that contains very specific content about the physical and financial elements of the community. There are 3 types of reserve studies. So if a property's never had one done before, then it needs to start from scratch with what's called a full reserve study. In that type, the provider is essentially creating everything totally from scratch. That's going to require a pretty thorough site inspection, taking measurements, taking photos, basically gathering up all of the raw data that will eventually become the component list for that property. Now, after you've had a full study done, there are 2 types of update studies that could be done. The first type is called an update with a site visit. In that case, a new site inspection is taking place, but it will be based on the prior component list. So in that case, the provider is really just trying to identify any significant changes in life expectancies or cost estimates based on the current conditions of the property. Now, there are some states that require those types of updates at specific intervals, but generally speaking, the best practice is to have one done at least every 3 years or so. If you're wondering, in Florida, there is no specific requirement for doing a reserve study at all. So in our state, it's totally voluntary, but I think, pretty much anybody you ask, whether that's a attorney, a CPA, certainly you guys as managers, I think understand the value of doing a reserve study. Most people would agree about every 3, 4, or 5 years at most, you should have somebody coming back out to the property again. Now, the last type of study is called an update with no site visit, which is exactly what it sounds like. Still results in a whole new reserve study document, but instead of conducting a new inspection, in these cases, the provider will just be corresponding with the board or with the property manager to find out what projects have taken place or what new information has become available since the last time anybody was on site to do either the level 1 or the level 2. Okay, there are 2 parts to a reserve study. Those are called the physical analysis and the financial analysis. The physical analysis part of the study is where somebody comes out to do that on-site visual inspection of all the common areas. So that's going to include everything from the roof to the mechanical rooms, the amenities, lobby, basically anything and everything that the association is responsible for that needs to be evaluated. Obviously that involves taking lots of measurements, taking photos, but also documenting model numbers, serial numbers for equipment, really doing whatever it takes to get the raw data related to each component, which will eventually be used to determine those life expectancies and replacement costs. Okay, during this physical analysis, we always say it's very worthwhile to try to meet with a representative from the property. That could be a board member, it could be a manager like yourselves, but the idea there is to try and collaborate with the people who know the property well to gain from their insight, right? If you've been living there for a number of years, if you've been managing that community all day, every day, you're naturally going to have some good information. You're going to know what the concerns are, and that's very valuable information to somebody like us who's going to come in and use that information and help make some recommendations for you. All right, the second part is called what we call the financial analysis. This is the part that takes place back at the office where we organize all that raw data that came from the site inspection and we can start to begin analyzing that. Okay, this is where we research particular costs or project history details, and typically we're going to compare that information with our experience working with similar properties. The idea is to try and fill in any gaps and kind of put together almost like a journal or a diary of what has happened in that property. When was the last time you painted? How much did that cost? Have you had any history of concrete restoration? How old are your elevators? Once we start answering all those questions, then we can start to make some financial conclusions. Okay, there are 3 outcomes to a reserve study. I'll go through these one at a time. The first outcome is what we call the component list. So just to define that, the word component in this context really just means some instance where the association will be spending money. Okay, so a reserve component could be a roof replacement project, could be a swimming pool resurfacing, could be a lobby remodel or renovation. But whatever it is, for each component, there are 3 key pieces of information that need to be determined. So first, we need to determine the useful life of that component. What I mean by that is its overall lifespan, or how long is it going to be in place from start to finish, either from when it was originally installed by the developer or from when it was most recently replaced until that will need to be done again. The second estimate, second data point, is its remaining useful life. Okay, now that number is going to be determined relative to a certain point in time. So for example, let's say you've got a component with a useful life of 10 years, and as of this fiscal year, it's only 3 years old. In that case, you would say that, again, as of this fiscal year, its remaining useful life should be about 7 years. Of course, lastly, we need to come up with an estimate for its replacement cost. I've been asked over the years if the word replacement is really important here. So just to make that clear, you don't always have to be fully replacing something to justify it as a reserve component. Okay, so you could just as easily say upgrade, remodel, modernize, resurface, or something else. So the point is, don't get too hung up on that word choice. Instead, you want to keep your focus on whatever it takes. What is the reason you're spending money, and how will that project provide value to the association? All right. A little bit of a discussion here. At this point, you may be wondering how we determine what goes on the list. Okay. Now, I talked earlier about the Florida statutes and what they have to say with respect to this process, but I'm going to give you a different approach now. Okay. Now, most professional reserve study providers are going to be using this 4-part test, which comes from National Reserve Study Standards. Now, this is more of an open-ended definition of what a reserve component should be. And the beauty of the 4-part test is that it can be applied to any different type of community. So instead of going into a project with some kind of predetermined checklist like the statutes would suggest, we're going to go in with our eyes open, and we're looking for anything on the property that might meet this type of criteria. So we'll talk through each of these 4 parts one at a time. All right, the first part is that the component in question here has to be the association's responsibility. That part should be pretty obvious. So an example of something that usually fails this part of the test would be windows and doors in a condo building, right? You guys probably are familiar. I would say at least 99% of the time, the way the documents are written is that the individual unit owners are responsible for replacement of their own windows and doors. So in those cases, there's no need to include those in the reserve study and the funding plan. Another example could be an HOA where you've got roads that are maintained by the city or by the county. Obviously, there would be no need to include any funding for road repaving if it's not the community's job to do that. Okay, the second part of the test is that the component has to have a limited useful life. So in our world, we don't use the word forever, but if something should last indefinitely and there's no timeline where you would ever expect to replace something, then it really shouldn't be considered in your reserve plan. As an example, you can think of something like the foundation of a building or structural walls, maybe the conduit inside the walls. Those should last the life of the property, however long that is. And so therefore, you would not ever be actively funding for their replacement. Okay, at that point, it's more likely that there's another developer who's going to come in, knock that building down and build something new than it would be that you'd ever be replacing those things. Okay, the third part of the test is maybe the most complicated. A component has to have a predictable remaining useful life in order for it to be appropriate to include that in the reserve plan. Now, the key word here is predictable. And to be more specific, what I mean is predictability in terms of scope and frequency. Okay, so if you can't reliably predict how much money you'll be spending on something or how often, then it's probably not a good idea to handle that thing through reserves. So let me give you an example. Many of our clients, many associations will ask us, hey, can we include our insurance deductible as part of our reserve plan? That's a very big, scary number, and we're scared that if we have to pay that one day, it's going to be a huge burden, so we want to list that as a reserve component. And our response when we hear that question is going to be, well, okay, if we were to define this as a reserve component, what should its useful life be? In other words, how often will you have to pay that deductible? Which of course nobody knows. That's the whole reason that you have insurance in the first place. Those expenses are going to come as a surprise, typically a result of some natural disaster, a fire, a hurricane. And to make some arbitrary prediction about how often that might occur is really kind of getting away from responsible planning. Now, I want to be clear, that's not to say that we don't recommend that you have some kind of plan in place, okay? This is Florida. There's definitely going to be more hurricanes over the years. Luckily, we seem to be dodging the ones that have come through in the last week or two. That our luck is going to run out at some point, okay? The problem, though, is that we just don't know how often or how severe those storms might be, and so really there's no way for us to responsibly tell our clients when they'll have to pay that insurance deductible. In those cases, normally what we say is that it's probably a good idea to have some kind of third account for the association, right? We talked about having your operating account for your routine expenses. We're going to have our reserve account for all the components that do meet this criteria. But it might be a good idea to have some kind of emergency fund or an emergency line of credit available that would be there for the community in the event they have to pay that deductible. Okay, so again, just the problem with listing it as a reserve component is that ultimately you're going to be basing a certain type of funding calculation off of the timeline of expenses. And if those expenses don't fall in line with the plan, then all the calculations go out the window, right? So, if you were to just guess and assume that, every 10 years you'll have to pay your deductible, but then we get a period where you have, a major hurricane 3 times in 5 years, and you're expecting that your reserve account can fund the deductible every time, the reality is that you're probably much more likely to pull money away from some other reserve components that did have a predictable lifespan. And likely result of that would be that you'll need special assessments to make up for the shortfall. Okay. The last criteria on the test here, and I know this is a lot to cover on one slide, but the question here is, does the component represent a significant cost to the association? So I told you earlier how the statutes, at least the condo statute 718, uses the number of $10,000. But again, that's a totally arbitrary number. In our experience, for most associations, that threshold could be or should be set much lower than that. The advantage to doing it that way is that, yes, you'll have more components listed in your reserve schedule, but that will take the pressure off of the operating budget, which would otherwise be the only place that could absorb those costs when they come along. Right? So if you think about a smaller association, maybe they have 6 projects that cost $5,000 each. Now, technically speaking, they would be consistent with the statutes if they left those out of the reserve plan because individually they cost under that $10,000 number. But you can imagine a scenario where all 6 of those projects happen to occur around the same time. Collectively, that's a total expense of $30,000 that they would have to try and squeeze into their operating budget for that year. And if cash flow is a little tight, then that could end up being a little bit of a tough situation. Okay. Good news is that if they had if they had listed those in their reserve plan, then they would have the ability to spend reserve money on those assets, and hopefully that's less disruptive to the community. So the point here is that there's no one number that will be appropriate for any and all associations. I think it was kind of silly when they wrote the statute to just say all condos are subject to this $10,000 number, but that's what we've got to work with for now. Okay, on this slide here, I drew this little red bracket around the top 3 components, which are the only ones that are specifically mentioned by those Florida statutes. If you look down the rest of the list, you'll see a lot of other things that probably look familiar. I know the statute, again, has this definition of anything over $10,000, but the problem is that not all boards, not all associations are really just aware of how much things cost. So to give you an idea, just for context, I would say that a small, simple townhome style community oftentimes will have maybe 15 or 20 components in their study. But if you have a luxury high-rise, like the type that you guys manage, it's very easy to have 50, 75, even 100 components, if not more than that. So, okay, I'm going to run through these this next batch here pretty quick. Hall of Shame speaks for itself. This picture, wood fence, it's probably going to get knocked down by the next puff of wind that comes by. This one is pretty bad. This is a fence around the perimeter of a pool area. So in this case, this was an HOA where you've got kids running around all over the place. I think the fence is about 4 feet tall, so just the right height for kids to try and jump over it. Pretty easy to imagine that ending up with a nasty cut and maybe an ER visit. Not to mention this is obviously an eyesore. Okay, so imagine being a realtor trying to give a tour of this community. And if this is what your client sees as soon as you walk into the pool area, you have to ask yourself, what does that say about the property? Okay, if the fence is this bad, then it's probably not very secure in the first place. You could get knocked down and not even do a good job of keeping people out of the pool area, which, again, if there's a lot of kids in the neighborhood, that's got to be a very high priority. Okay, next one here is pretty interesting. This is a boiler that actually caught on fire. Amazingly, this fire just kind of burned itself out before it blew up the boiler and took out a chunk of the garage in this property with it. Clearly, the association wasn't doing a good job of routine inspections here. The reason I know that is because we were the ones who actually discovered this had happened and had to go back to the engineer and the manager and basically point out to them that, hey, you know, one of your boilers caught on fire. Okay, last one here. This has a bit of a story to go with it. This is the bathroom at a clubhouse. I remember walking into this building, very interesting situation. It was padlocked from the outside. And from what I understand, pretty soon after our inspection, the whole building had to be condemned. Okay. Now, I was walking the property with a board member who was an original owner in that community. I think it was built sometime in the 1980s. And talking with her, getting some of the history about the property, she said that, you know, back in the day, their community's clubhouse was this huge, you know, asset, this jewel of the neighborhood, right? It was a place where kids would have birthday parties, and they did a big New Year's Eve bash, and I believe she said they hosted a couple of weddings at some point. So the point is, it was this great, you know, benefit to the association and even to the surrounding neighborhood. But what happened over the years was that the residents wanted to keep their focus on keeping the dues low and cutting from the budget to try to keep those assessments from increasing. So what happened was they basically stopped funding the reserves for their amenity areas. Eventually, they just got so far behind, they couldn't keep up with the maintenance cost. They had to kind of take their clubhouse out of service, and it became a hideout for homeless people and drug users. And, you know, you can kind of see from the photo what that ended up looking like. So, you know, we saw the full circle here. This was a complete transformation from this building, this amenity that was a great asset, which eventually became a complete liability to the point they had to knock the building down entirely. Okay, our second outcome, we're going to talk about the evaluation of current reserve fund strength, which is something we typically measure in terms of percent funded. Now, one of the best ways that I've found to explain this concept is to use the analogy of a credit score. So we've all had our credit reports pulled. We all know what our credit scores are. To an outside party like a bank or a credit card company, you know that score is an indicator of what kind of risk you are. So in the same way, if you think of the reserve study itself like a credit report, and you have to boil it down to one key result, then I feel like that number would be percent funded. We measure it on a 0 to 100% scale, and we consider anything between 0 and 30% funded to be a weak position. In that range, associations will have a much higher likelihood of special assessments and loans and other types of cash flow problems. So once you get above 30% funded, that's where we call that sort of this fair range, more of a moderate risk. You know, things are not an emergency anymore, but there's still a lot of room for improvement there. Where you really want to be is above 70% funded. That's where we've seen you have statistically the lowest risk of those types of cash flow problems. Okay, we've talked about it as a concept. We'll now walk through the process of how do you actually calculate percent funded. The idea is pretty simple. All we're really doing in this case is we're going to look at how much money the association has at some point in time, and then compare that amount against how much money it should have at the same point in time. We're going to divide those numbers and then compare that, express that comparison rather as a percentage. Okay. So the first part, how much money do you have? Pretty straightforward. You know, basically we're just going to look at the current financial statements and try to model the cash flow looking up to the next fiscal year. So, you know, these days we're looking primarily at January 1st, 2021, trying to figure out how much money will these buildings have in the bank at that point in time. Okay. Now, the second part, the next step, is we compare that amount against how much money they should have. Okay, now that notion or that concept of how much money they should have, that amount is what we call the fully funded balance for that community. Okay. Now that, I want to make clear that fully funded balance is a theoretical number. Okay. The way that I put it in perspective is if I were to ask you a question. Okay. If I tell you that some association, just any association in Florida, has $50,000 in reserves. Okay, but I haven't told you anything else about the community, right? You don't know where it is, how big it is, how many units. Have I really told you anything at all? Okay. Now, I'll hear this sort of thing all the time from board members, and you guys may have heard this too. Somebody might say, yeah, we're doing fine. We've got $900,000 in reserves. But we have to point out that, yeah, that's definitely a nice chunk of change. That sounds like a lot of money. But I have no idea if that's adequate for your situation unless we have something to compare it against. Okay, so again, it all depends on what type of property you're looking at. If you have a little two-story condo, no amenities, just a little parking lot, it might be that $50,000 is plenty of money for them. But if you're dealing with a luxury high-rise, you guys know, especially you guys with AKAM, being that you manage so many of these Miami area high-rises, you know that $50,000 can be a drop in the bucket, right? That's gone in one installment towards one project, so nowhere near enough money to have. All right, I'm going to dig one level deeper on this. Talk about how we actually calculate the fully funded balance. It's a pretty simple idea. Basically, you just look at how old a component is compared to its overall lifespan, and that will give you a fraction. We then multiply that fraction by the current estimated cost of that component, which will tell us how much money you should have today for its eventual replacement. Okay, now when we do a reserve study, it doesn't matter if the association has 4 components or 400. What you do is you just calculate the fully funded balance for each one and then add all of those theoretical numbers together. That will give you the fully funded balance for the entire association. And then, of course, once you've done that, now you will have something that you can use to compare their actual cash on hand and try to put that number in perspective. All right, so we'll just run through a quick example of that. Let's all just pretend we're managing this community. We'll call it Seaview Condominiums, and we want to calculate percent funded. Okay, pretty simple example. The first thing we have to do is to look at the starting reserve balance. So let's say that we've reviewed our financial statements and we've modeled our spending for this year. We know based on the 2020 budget how much is going into that account. So let's say we've done the arithmetic and that will have this starting position of, let's say, $60,000 going into the next fiscal year. The next thing that we need to do is calculate the fully funded balance for each of the components in that property. Okay, so for the sake of this example, we're just going to assume it's 3 things. First, we'll look at the roof. Okay, let's say the roof is 10 years old with an overall useful life of 20 years, and let's give it an estimated replacement cost of $80,000. So again, keep in mind that the fully funded balance is only the proportion of the cost that you need to have on hand today. So since the roof is halfway through its life, what that means is that you only really need to have half of the replacement cost saved up right now. Because again, you're recognizing you have another 10 years to collect the difference. So in this case, what you would do is you take 10 over 20 and you multiply that by $80,000, which tells us that the theoretical fully funded balance for this roof as of right now is $40,000. Again, it's halfway through its life. So you only need to have half of the cost in the bank today. Okay, we'll do another one. Let's say we're doing the math for our gym equipment. Let's say that it's 5 years old with an overall life of 15 years and a replacement cost of $30,000. If we use those numbers, then we know that the fully funded balance for the gym equipment needs to be $10,000. Makes sense. Again, it's only a third of the way through its life. So in theory, you only need to have 1/3 of the replacement cost in the bank today. Okay, we'll do one more. Let's say we painted the hallways of this building 2 years ago, and if we want to do that every 8 years at a cost estimate of $100,000, you take 2 divided by 8, so it's 1/4 or 25% of the way through its life, which means that if you have that cost estimate of 100 grand, your fully funded balance will be 25,000. Okay. So again, now that you have your starting reserve balance, that was the $60,000 number we figured out, and now that we've calculated the individual fully funded balances for each component, now we're able to determine what is the percent funded for this entire association. Okay, so if you take the 3 numbers you've just calculated, you add them together, you've got 40,000 for the roof, 10,000 for the gym equipment, 25,000 for painting. If you add those together, you have this combined total of $75,000. Now, once you've done that, you can look back at the actual $60,000 you have on hand, you divide 60 by 75, and you figure that this community is 80% funded. Okay? Now, before we move on from this last section here, I'm just going to talk about how we draw some financial conclusions. Okay, based on that level of percent funded, we're able to actually interpret that and figure some things out about this community. So what you're looking at on this chart here, this is the result of a huge internal kind of study that we did as a company a number of years ago. We were looking at a data set of thousands of associations we'd worked with, and we wanted to look at two variables. First, what was the percent funded level for that community? And then secondly, did we have to include a special assessment recommendation as part of their funding plan? So the results, are going to be pretty obvious. The closer you are to 0% funded, the higher the chances you need an immediate special assessment. Now, the good news here is that you see that risk declining very quickly. Once you're out of that weak range at 30% funded, now at 40%, it was only 10% of the time. And it goes down really dramatically from there, right? So again, once you're above 70% funded, that's where we consider that strong position to start. A couple years later, we did another kind of internal study again. This time we were looking at whether there was any correlation between percent funded for communities and the actual property values of the homes in those communities. This time what we did was look at a large data set. It was a metropolitan area of Southern California, kind of the greater LA area. And this time we selected a huge group of properties that were all as similar as they could be in terms of size and age and amenities and so forth. What we did now is to take the appraised market value of the homes in those communities to see what difference it made when the associations themselves were in a better financial position. So to be specific, we were looking for any type of increase in property value we would see when the associations themselves were in a better financial position as measured by percent funded. So the first thing we did here was to take this baseline. We kind of established the starting point as those who were in the weak position between 0 and 30% funded. And we're looking now at what happens to property value when those comparable associations were in a fair position, again, between 30 and 70%. So again, all else being as equal as possible, what we found in this case was that the communities that were in the fair position were about 8% more valuable than the ones that were in the weak position. And the really interesting thing is that when you got above 70% funded, right, what we saw there was about a 13% gain over those that were in the weak position. So intuitively, you can kind of feel how that might be the case. The ones that have the money in the bank tend to have better curb appeal. They're in better physical condition, which of course translates into those being more attractive to potential buyers. So if you go back to kind of one of these foundational questions, why have reserves at all? One answer is that, if you have reserves, that can definitely translate back to you in the form of higher property values. Sometimes I'll make that point to boards, and I would encourage you to do the same, is that when you're trying to get people to go along with funding reserves or even passing a special assessment for that matter, you want to make the case that that is not some tax, right? That's not money that those people are never going to see again. All it is a reinvestment back into the property that they already own, right? So people really don't lose money when they fund reserves. It just translates back into the bottom line in terms of making their condo or their home more valuable, okay? Now I'm looking at the clock here. I don't want to go off track too much. I'll just have a couple more of these Hall of Shame pictures. I'm going to skip to maybe some of the better ones. This is a property with a huge tower in the center of the community with different amenities on each floor. Unfortunately, the tower is pretty much abandoned at this point for a lot of the same reasons that we saw with that clubhouse example. But they had, an auditorium, a billiards room, or, kind of what's left of it, as you can see there, everything looking pretty much like this, just, totally abandoned. This one here has got a bit of a story. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with concrete restoration and how that can go for a building, but I just wanted to point this one out. This is actually not a client of ours. It's the only one that's not a client, but when I walked by this, I had to stop and take a picture because this shows exactly what happens to concrete if you're not funding for it, right? If you're not taking care of your painting and waterproofing cycles. This is ultimately what happens to concrete if it's left exposed to the environment. If you remember, not too long ago, there was a building in Miami where a balcony actually just basically fell off the side of the building. I think it was a New Year's Eve party at the time. There were maybe 6 or 8 people standing on the balcony. Fortunately for them, it was only on the 2nd floor, but as you can see, similar to what happened here, that rebar structure that's holding the concrete together just rusted and disintegrated to the point of failure. Balcony fell off the building onto a parked car. Luckily, again, that was right beneath it. Very fortunately, nobody got killed, but I think some of those people end up going to the hospital. I guess, as a manager, as a board member, how'd you like to be on the phone the next day when you start getting the calls from those people's attorneys and trying to figure out what happened there? So not a position I hope any of you ever find yourselves in. Okay. Just a couple more slides here, and then we'll open this up to Q&A. But we'll talk about that third outcome of a reserve study, which is the funding plan. Now, if you think about the first 2 outcomes we talked about, those were the component list, which essentially defines what you're reserving for, and then percent funded, which tells us where the community stands as of this point in time financially. But now that you've defined those 2 things, the last question is, well, where do you go from here? Okay, so one of the first things that we do, and what you should be doing when you're looking at your funding plan, is to look at your current budget and just try to model out what happens if the community stays on the same path that they're on. Given the future expenditures you've identified, if it's not clear that the existing plan will be sufficient, then obviously you're going to have to make some changes. 2 of the other points I like to make here is that the funding of reserves needs to be consistent with the timing of your overall assessments. So for example, if you have monthly dues to the association, then there has to be a monthly reserve contribution. I believe by law that has to be done within 30 days. So in other words, what you can't do is just operate throughout the year hoping that at the end of the year you have some kind of surplus in your operating budget, which you can then drop into your reserve account and say, hey, let's pat ourselves on the back, we funded our reserves this year. It doesn't work that way. That has to be a proactive plan. Now, the last point that I make here is that in those cases where the historical contribution rate has not been sufficient and the association's in a bad financial spot, unfortunately, then there might need to be an initial special assessment that's part of that plan. And in those cases, I always point out to board members that, look, this is appropriate to think of this special assessment as a catch-up contribution for all the years that you were not funding reserves enough, right? It should not ever be a surprise that if your budget is too low, if you're trying to cut your dues for 5, 10, 15 years at a time, that's eventually going to catch up with you, and that's most often why you need a special assessment. There's some principles that we look at when we're designing these funding plans. We'll talk about these individually. First and foremost, as you look towards the future and you're trying to model those reserve expenditures over time, at the bare minimum, the amount of money that you put into reserves needs to ensure that you have some amount of available cash left. Okay, that's the bare minimum requirement. It's something that we call baseline funding. But basically, the idea is that if you don't have any money in reserves, you're guaranteed to have special assessments or loans, which is, again, one of the things we're trying to prevent and avoid in the first place. The contribution rate to reserves also has to be stable. So what that means, for example, is that you can't have these huge spikes and decreases in the contribution rate over time just based on arbitrary fluctuations. So in other words, it's not fair to assume that there's some future group of owners in this building who will be perfectly happy and willing and able to just double their reserve contribution rate overnight, which will make it a lot easier on the owners who live there today. Okay, you're not allowed to plug in any balloon contributions. So for example, if you've got a $1 million roof replacement project that's scheduled to happen 10 years from now, you're not allowed to just operate with the expectation that you can keep your dues very low for all these years, and then in the 9th year, you're going to raise $900,000, which would allow you to do the minimum between now and then. You also don't get to take years off. Okay, so what that means is that let's say you've just spent a huge amount of money modernizing your elevators, and now that won't need to be done again for another 20 or 25 years, but that does not mean that you stop funding your reserves for elevator modernization. Okay, it's definitely going to happen again, even though it's a long time from now. And the idea is that you begin funding for that next time as early as possible so as to spread the cost of the component over the longest period of time that you can. The idea is that the association membership should be paying for the deterioration of their components over the entire useful life of the asset, not all at once, right, when something fails. When you do it that way, that means everybody pays their fair share, and it's not just the unlucky people who happen to live in that building when a certain component expires, right? That's like a very nasty game of musical chairs. Okay, now the last but maybe most important principle to follow when we're designing these funding plans is that they've got to be fiscally responsible. So let me talk about what I mean by that. That means you're being realistic with respect to interest and inflation. So we know it's not realistic to assume that you're going to earn 10% interest each year on your reserve funds. Unfortunately, reserve money really can't be invested in anything very exciting. So that means that you should be assuming a fairly low return on those funds. Now, with respect to inflation, you also want to be realistic there. So what we've found is that through historical data points over a long enough period of time, the average annual inflation rate tends to be about 3%. Okay, now if you're assuming that the cost of a project 15 years from now is going to be the same as what it cost you today, you're going to be way off. Your plan's just not going to work. Okay, the second point on this slide speaks to being honest about the situation that you're in. Okay, if your association has not historically done a good job of funding its reserves, then it's critical to address that, to confront that. It's just plain financially irresponsible to continue operating the way that you have just to try and maintain the status quo. Okay, it is not the job of the board of directors to make owners happy or to keep the dues low compared to the building next door. Now, speaking of the owners, your reserve funding plan cannot be biased in favor of the people who live there now at the expense of the people who will live there later on. Again, we can't assume that they're just going to pick up the tab for us, right? Now, lastly, this all takes place despite what may have happened up to now. We see this kind of thing all the time. Prior budgets, prior associations were not funding the reserves, and the people that live there now have had the can kicked to them. That's not an excuse to kick the can down the road for the next group of people. Okay, in a perfect world, of course, all associations would have been carefully managed and guided over the years to have a stable, healthy amount of money in the bank. In reality, you guys know that's usually not the case. But that does not in any way remove the obligation from the board to act responsibly and fulfill their fiduciary duty. Okay. Having said all of that, at the end of the day, of course, we recognize that this is going to be a challenge for most buildings out there. If an association has been operating for many years without funding properly, then there's a very good chance they'll be in a financial hole that's going to be very difficult to climb out of. But if that's the case, then it's important not to put lipstick on a pig and try to talk yourselves out of that. The owners in the community deserve to make an informed decision. And we think that having a reserve study done might be a great way to make that possible. Okay, the people there need to know that if the reserves are not funded properly, then the only logical conclusion will be those special assessments, those loans that are going to come around when things need to be done. All right, so just to bring this full circle, if you remember the guy that we saw way back in the beginning, eyes closed, fingers crossed, just sort of hoping for the best. I hope that if I've done my job for you guys here today, you'll know by now, you'll agree that that mindset is not a substitute for a responsible plan. And I hope you've all got some good information today that will translate and benefit to the communities that you manage. So at this point, I'll open this back up to questions and turn my camera back on here. Let's see what we've got. Thank you all for hanging in. I'm going to try to get through these as best I can. In the meantime, I'm also going to launch a poll for you. So there's only, I think, 4 questions here. If you wouldn't mind giving me your feedback on the poll questions, that'll help me to kind of determine if we're on the right track here and how we can make this course a little bit better. So I'll launch that for you now. And if you would be so kind as to start filling that out. In the meantime, I'm going to go to the Q&A section. And we've got a question from Carlos. All right, Carlos. He says, during our smoke evacuation recertification process, a punch list of repairs was generated. Dampers now have to be replaced for a total of $18,000. Can they be funded with reserves? Good question. So to me, we would kind of go back initially to that 4-part test. Obviously the association is responsible. Clearly these have a limited useful life. They failed, at some point. Do they have a predictable remaining life? You know, that kind of remains to be seen. But if it happened once, I think you can make a reasonable guess that it would happen again. And then the cost is certainly above a significant threshold. $18,000, a lot of money, certainly above the $10,000 number that comes from statutes. So I would say that it should be funded from reserves going forward. Now, the question is, if your prior budgets did not include any number for those dampers, if they were never considered in your reserve plan before, then your accountant may say, you know, if it wasn't factored into the contribution rate before, you can't spend money on this now. To me, those are kind of integral to your fire protection systems, though. So if you had a line item in there for fire alarm system repairs or even exhaust fans in the building, something like that would be, I think, an appropriate use of reserve funds. So again, smart to double check with your accountant, maybe with your attorney to be safe, but to me that seems like a reasonable thing to do. Uriel, thank you very much for the comments. I appreciate it. We'll hang on. I think we've got only 3 people have finished the poll, so if you guys can get through that, I would appreciate it. I'll hang on the line if anybody else has any questions. If you don't, you're free to go. The class is over. We are going to send out the recording of this along with the slides. So, you know, if you leave now, you'll still be able to get the benefit of any other questions that people ask. So, again, I'll hang on the list, and I'm at your service. So. Okay. All right. Well, we got a little more than half gone through the poll. Again, just as a reminder, if you guys have any board members that you think might benefit from this, you know, we try to make the content approachable to people who are volunteers that have never been through this before. Feel free to share this with them. I've got a whole nother class called Reserve Study Roadmap for Managers, which is geared entirely around the concept of straight line and pooled funding. So if you have questions on that subject matter, we do have a recording of that class available on YouTube. If anybody wants to get a copy of that recording, just shoot me an email. My email should be up on the screen there now. Happy to share that, but that's, you know, again, gets into the kind of more advanced concepts, the nuts and bolts of how to actually create a funding plan using either of those 2 methods. So yeah, let's see, we'll give it just another minute or 2. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to email those or check out our website, reservestudy.com. If you need proposals for any of your properties, you can get those from our website as well. You just click the Request a Proposal tab up there on the home screen, and we'll get that process started right away. So, okay, let's see, we might be getting close to the end here. We've got, looks like 11 people still on the line. I've got 6 out of 11 that have finished the poll. So if that's not showing up for you guys, that's okay. It's not a requirement to get credit or anything like that. So that's fine. But I guess that's about it. So yeah. I take it for now that we don't have any more questions. So again, I'll just say thanks for having me on. Pleasure to work with you all, and hopefully we'll be talking again soon. So we'll wrap this up and be on the lookout for a follow-up email coming your way, hopefully in the next couple of days. Okay, thanks everybody. Take care.